The Abyss 1266 Phi TC that I've got here in my hands is one of the most requested reviews I've had for quite some time in terms of headphones. And after reviewing the Abyss Diana TC, which is like a small version of this using some of the similar ideas, after reviewing that and not particularly liking it, I wasn't really sure how this was going to go. I know a lot of people love this headphone, a lot of people swear by it as a true flagship headphone, but I have to say that the road's been a little bit rocky for me with this one. That's not to say this is a negative or bad review, but as you'll see as we go along, things aren't all rosy with the 1266, at least not for me. I should start off with a huge thanks to channel viewer and patron Mark for sending me over the 1266, and just to reiterate, the specific model that I have here is a 1266 Phi TC. There's multiple variants of the 1266, so it is important for you to know exactly which version I'm talking about because there have been changes along the way. The 1266 here is a $6,000, although that's the base price for them, a $6,000 headphone. So they're a very expensive headphone. They're right up there with the HEADPHONE Susvara, although in reality you can often buy the Susvara for less than the $6,000 asking price. When we take a look at the 1266, you've got this really unique headband design, and I don't normally do this in headphones, but I'm putting this one on so you can see just how strange it is. It's a really unique design. Some people have joked that it looks like a torture device. I totally get that. And the reason it's designed the way it is that it's intended to have the cup sit kind of just against the head, not sealing fully so much as just being right there next to your ears, but also being able to adjust. And that for me is both a benefit and a negative of the 1266. I'll get to that in full detail shortly, but before we do, I just want to mention a few things about the design. These are an all aluminium, when I say all aluminium, the main chassis parts of this are aluminium with a beautiful ceramic finish on them. They look and feel really high quality. They're a very angular and industrial style design, but one that's been executed very well. Inside each of the housings here, we've got 66mm drivers, so nice big planar magnetic drivers. And these come in with an impedance of 50 ohms and sensitivity of 88 decibels per milliwatt, which is pretty low, but when you actually think about it, they're not anywhere near as hard as I thought they were to drive. And the reason I say that is if you look at them compared to something like the Susvara, which is the other headphone that's often talked about as being like the two equally most difficult headphones to drive, driving these to 110 decibels will require about 159 milliwatts. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting you should be using an amplifier with only 160 milliwatts, but the point is if you've got an amplifier that's putting out somewhere around about 500-600 milliwatts into a load around that sort of 50-60 ohm mark, then you should be pretty comfortable driving these with it. In contrast, to deliver exactly the same 110 decibels, the Susvara needs about 500 milliwatts. So there's a big difference there. Even though they're both relatively difficult to drive, these are nowhere near as challenging as the Susvara. Before we wrap up on the design, specifications, etc., something else I should mention is that on the bottom of these, we've got mini XLR connectors. And these use a 3-pin mini XLR instead of the 4-pin used by most other companies. And that's a little bit of a shame because it means the headphone cables you might have for your Audizies, ZMFs or Mezes aren't going to plug into the Abyss. And then to compound that problem just a little bit more, the cable that you get with the 1266, in my opinion, isn't the nicest to use. Sound-wise, it might be fine, but as you can probably hear in my hands, it creaks a lot when it rubs against itself, it doesn't feel the best, and it's actually a twin cable the whole way down to the XLR plug. So you can see here I've got the 4-pin XLR that goes into the amp, and then it's immediately a 2-cable run all the way up to the headphones, and so that for me makes it a less enjoyable cable to interact with. Like I said, it's not a bad cable, but I just don't think it's as good as some other fantastic aftermarket cables out there. And I know that many of you out there, like me, enjoy using a quality fabric-wrapped cable or a really nice soft braided cable, and this just doesn't quite stack up ergonomically to those. Another thing about the cable and socket design, going back to the headphones now, is that these sockets come straight out the bottom of the headphone. And what that means is that when they're on the head, the cable's kind of coming down and having to kink fairly sharply over the shoulders. And that's an area where I also think I'd like to see, particularly of a headphone at this level and this quality of design, it would have been nice to see these connectors just tilted slightly towards the front a little bit, because that would have allowed for a more comfortable drape of the cable over the shoulder, particularly when it is a fairly kind of noticeable cable from an ergonomic point of view. It doesn't softly bend as it comes out of there and crosses the shoulders. It's a little bit more rigid than some other premium cables. The final design specification to talk about, and this is going to lead us into things like the adjustment and the comfort of these, is that the Abyss 1266 is a heavy headphone. Coming in at 640 grams, that's a very heavy weight to be carrying around on your head, and unfortunately it does result in a bit of a hotspot for me after a period of time. It's not an uncomfortable headphone as such. In many ways, I think Abyss have done a great job at balancing the way it does spread the load across the head. But the end result is that weight is weight, and unfortunately I did find after extended listening, I was getting hot spots on my head. Now this is something that's going to vary from person to person. We all have different sensitivities, different head shapes, etc. But these can't, for me, come anywhere near headphones like the Meze Elite or the ZMF Caldera when it comes to comfort and long-term wearing. Even the Susvara I would rate as significantly better. And so now while we're talking about wearing these headphones, let's talk about what that actually means. As I said before, these are a really unusual design. They've got this very square style instead of that rounded finish that we're used to seeing on headphones. And a big part of that, as I said before, is that they're meant to sit on top of the head with the headband, and then the speakers or the cups themselves are meant to sit on either side of the ear, just not quite sealing. In order to achieve that, the headband's set up in such a way that it is able to expand a little bit sort of left to right, so you can actually expand it that way if you need to. But what I found was that there is absolutely no way you're ever going to get a full seal on these. And that kind of brings us to a really interesting point. When you break the seal on a headphone like these, what you're going to start to find is there's a certain resonance from the driver that's going to create a peak in the bass. The problem is that exactly where that peak falls and how big that peak is, that's going to vary depending on how much you break the seal. Now what was really interesting, and I'll probably come back around to this in sound quality in a bit more detail, but what was interesting was that when I looked at the graphs on the Abyss website, what I was seeing was a measurement that looked to me like the headphone when it's actually sealed. And yet, when you talk to anyone at Abyss, you talk to anyone that owns these and has spent any time with them, they all talk about the fact that you actually want them to break seals slightly because that's where their bass performance comes from. And so it's kind of curious to me. There's a few things that are going on here. Firstly, you cannot actually, if you've got a head of my size or smaller, there's actually no way you can adjust them to ever get a seal against your ears. And again, if you talk to Abyss, they'll say they're not meant to. But then I did find that somewhat contradictory that the measurement on the website seems to show it with the seal intact. To add further complexity to the sound and the fit and the finish, and there's a lot of ground to cover here, I'm going to try and pull this all together by the time we get to the end of this section. Another thing to think about is that this headband, in addition to stretching left and right, should you want more width on the headband, which I don't think too many people are actually going to need, in addition to being able to create more width, you can also tilt the headphones forwards or backwards slightly, meaning that they can come slightly forward of the ear or behind the ear, and that's going to create sort of a toe-in, toe-out effect like you would with speakers, but it's also going to mean you're going to be able to break the seal more or break the seal less, depending on the direction you turn it. To add another layer of adjustment to it, for better or worse, as we'll talk about, another layer of adjustment is that these pads, which, by the way, are a lovely kind of plush leather pad, these pads are designed, if you look at the back of them, they've got these notches around them that lets you put the pad in all sorts of different positions. Now, while the marketing will tell you that there's actually lots and lots of different positions you can put these in to adjust the sound and the comfort to your preference, the reality is there's probably only half a dozen actual positions that are going to make sense for almost everybody. And that is because with the shape of the pad, you're going to need the thicker part of the pad behind the ear. And what it more comes down to is whether or not the pad sits kind of horizontal, so to speak, or if you tilt the thickest part of the pad to come down under the back of the ear a little bit. The chances of anyone actually wanting this thick part to be rotated all the way around to the front of the ear, it just doesn't seem to make much sense to me. It's going to create a huge hole, a huge gap behind the ear, and as you'll see shortly, it's going to completely mess with the frequency response. And this brings me to my first kind of concern with Abyss overall. And I don't want this to sound like I'm bashing Abyss. As you're going to hear me talk about, I actually really like the sound of these. But there's just a few things that concern me with some of the practices of this company. And that is that there's a lot of marketing that doesn't actually stack up in the real world once you get your hands on the product and play with it. For example, the graph that's shown is the graph with the seal, but all the marketing recommends that you should be breaking the seal to get the best sound. Likewise, they talk about these pads having all these different points of adjustment, when actually in the real world, there's only a very small range that you're likely to find effective for the majority of people. And this theme's going to come around again when we look at the sound quality. I'll talk about it then. But it just puts me a little bit on edge. Not maybe on edge is probably too strong, but it makes me just a little bit uncomfortable with the brand. It makes me wonder where the marketing ends and the actual skill and the know-how begins. And I don't mean that as a knock on Abyss. I don't know the people there. I don't know their qualifications. I just think there could be a disconnect between the technical side of the business and the marketing side of the business, or maybe there's more marketing and less technical. I don't know. The point is, it just leaves me a little bit uncomfortable with them as a brand. As I said, I like the sound of these. I'll talk about that shortly, but it's not a smooth road for me as to whether I can say I think Abyss are great overall, whether I think the 1266 is great overall. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of intricacy to how I feel about these. If you're trying to work out what piece of gear you should buy next, then the Passion for Sounds Recommends database might be helpful for you. In the description box of every single video, just down here, you'll find the Passion for Sounds Recommends section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the Passion for Sounds Recommends Airtable database. What you'll see in here is every single product that I've ever reviewed and recommend, in some cases products that I own but maybe haven't reviewed but recommend. And then once you're in here, you can use the filter button up here to decide to filter by things like whether or not the product type is for a headphone, for example. So maybe you're looking for a headphone. Filter it by that and you can now see every headphone I recommend. You can sort it by price, which is the default sorting, or any other sorting method that you want. And then once you've got the list of products you're looking for, you've got the links to the reviews of the products, and then also purchasing links for global retailers and also regional retailers for the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So feel free to play around with this, sort it, filter it however you want to. It won't affect what anybody else sees, and you can hopefully find just the right products for you. I hope this is helpful, and now let's get back to the review. Moving on now though, and starting to wrap up the kind of comfort and ergonomics and getting into the sound quality, one of the challenges I have with these is that a lot of people talk about the fact that you need to get them set up just right, it can take you a couple of weeks to get used to it, etc., etc. But the problem I find is that every time you put them on your head, you're going to have to find that sweet spot again potentially. Because it's all going to come down to exactly how much rotation there is. That's going to be affected by how tight this screw on top is. So if it's at all loose, which this one is a little bit, then I could pick these up and twist them a little bit more forwards or backwards than I realized. I'm going to have to check that every time. Obviously I can tighten that screw and keep it tight. That's fine. But I just think there's a few too many variables. And that's probably a good chance for us to talk now about sound quality and why this really matters. I'm not talking about the variability of the sort of fit and adjustment of these from a pure kind of comfort point of view or general fit point of view. I'm talking about it from a sound quality point of view. And that's because if you take a look at the graphs I've got on screen now, this is an example where the headphones were fitted essentially, as far as I could see, essentially the same on the left and the right side of my measurement rig. However, as you can see from the graph, the sound that I was getting was actually different between the left and the right ear cup because they were sealing a little bit differently. And so what that means is that if you bought a $6,000 headphone thinking you're getting the absolute best possible sound, it's then potentially going to be undone a little bit if you start to not get them fitting just right on the both sides of your head. You could be getting more bass on one side than the other. You could be getting slightly different mid bass and lower mid response as well. And then on top of that, once we start breaking seal, we also have some phase issues to contend with. And so what you're kind of getting in the case of the 1266s is the same sort of sound as if you had a subwoofer in the room that's not quite time aligned with the rest of your speaker system. And so if we take the 1266 for just a moment and consider it like any other headphone, for any other headphone, the sound wave is coming off the front of the driver and it's going straight into your ear. At the same time, there will be sound waves coming off the back of the driver. That's just the way it works. And those sound waves go off into the environment, get absorbed by the environment, and are unable to get to your ears because of the pads. In the case of the 1266 though, because we're breaking the seal, some of that rear sound wave is able to get to the front. Now if you think about what that rear sound wave is, it's the exact opposite of the sound wave that's coming off the front of the driver. If you were able to play them both, the rear wave and the front wave, kind of at exactly the same time, you get no sound at all. It would cancel itself out. And so what's happening here is that the wave coming off the back of the driver is coming around, getting back into the front, and you're hearing both. You're going to be hearing the back wave at a lower volume because it had to come through various kind of obstacles and obstructions. And it's also going to arrive at your ears slightly later than the front sound wave. What that means though is you're getting some cancellation of frequencies, and that's going to create phase issues. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing, I think, in the case of the 1266. Where it can be a really good thing is it actually creates some really interesting staging effects. It produces a sense of space in the soundstage and helps with the imaging, I believe. But on the negative side of it, it's creating a sound that's not entirely natural and can sound a little bit incoherent if you're really paying attention. What it reminds me of most is if you've got a subwoofer in the room and the subwoofer's not quite perfectly time aligned with the speakers. And so you kind of hear and notice the impact and the punch of the sub. But if you stop and you really focus on it, you can tell that it's not a single point source of audio. Now, in the case of headphones, it is just one source of audio, but it's starting to split the sound up a little bit in a way that's interesting, but not entirely natural and true to the source. And so this might be sounding like I'm bashing the 1266 and saying they're a bad choice, and I'm absolutely not. But I do think it's really important that anybody out there considering buying these kind of understands what you're getting. They're a headphone that I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to. I've spent quite a number of sessions listening to them and I've enjoyed every single moment. But when it came to my direct comparisons and my critical listening, that's where things started to come a little bit unraveled. And so I'm going to go through my sound quality notes now, talk to you about what I heard in isolation, what I heard in comparison with the Meze Elites and the ZMF Calderas. But the one thing I want to mention before I do is that I know there's going to be people out there listening to what I'm saying, thinking it's highly critical, and they're going to start typing in the notes down there, things like you haven't adjusted them properly, you don't know how these work, you haven't given them enough power. So before we start having those conversations, let me tell you that I've spent plenty of time trying to work out the exact perfect position of these. I've measured them in multiple positions to properly understand them. I've watched plenty of videos from Abyss and from other people talking about the fit and the comfort and how to get these just right. So there's been no lack of care in that regard from me. As to sources I've paired them with, they've been driven by the TT2, the Burson Soloist 3X GT, they've been run by the Enlium Amp 23R, so there's been no lack of power delivered to these either, and no lack of quality for that matter too. I also can't stress enough that this is not me bashing them. This is me saying they're very enjoyable, but you need to know also where they might have shortcomings for you. I feel like these are quite a quirky headphone and I want you to know their quirks. If you know them and you go ahead and buy them because you know that and you're looking forward to what they're doing, that's fantastic. That's where you're going to enjoy them. But if you don't know their quirks and you buy them thinking they're going to be similar to a Susvara or an Elite or a Caldera, then you're going to be disappointed, and I'm trying to save you that disappointment. So let's talk about their sound quality now. The first thing I'd say about the 1266 is that they have a wonderful sense of clarity and articulation up top. There's a fantastic sense of attack on the leading edges of notes, but no harshness anywhere. It's a really nicely controlled and delivered treble. And not just treble, but general attack, articulation, etc. However, I did notice that as I started focusing my attention lower down into the mid-range and the bass, some of that sense of attack and clarity seemed to diminish. And I think that's possibly because of the phase issues that I spoke about before. What I think is happening is that it's lower frequencies that are going to sneak their way around the cups and get to your ears, whereas high frequencies are very directional. So if you're getting higher frequencies, they're coming off the back of the drivers, they're going straight out. Whereas the lower frequencies, being longer sound waves, they're going to creep around, sneak back into the ear cups, and start to muddy up some of that clarity of the leading edges of things like your bass notes, your upper bass, your lower mids. And that's where I think you do lose a little bit of articulation down low. It's not to say that they sound muddy or unclear or anything like that, but there's just a contrast for me in the clarity between the upper end of the register and the middle and lower ends of the register. And it's probably highlighted by the fact that the upper end is so spectacularly clean and detailed and crisp. I mentioned before that these are in no way harsh, but I also should clarify that if there is sibilance in the recording, if it's a hot recording with really spicy treble, these are going to show it to you. They're refined, but they're not smoothing anything over. As we carry down into the mid-range and the vocals, I find that they balance really well the combination of texture and kind of richness or resonance of voices. And as I'll talk a little bit more about when we get to soundstage and imaging, they tend to focus those vocals, any kind of key mid-range solos, instrumental solos, etc. They focus them really nicely right in front of you, but not too close. They're not an intimate headphone. They've got a lovely sense of space and depth to them. When we get into the bass territory now, things start to get a bit less predictable from the 1266. And that all comes down to a combination of what I said before about how much you're breaking the seal and how much of a peak and where that peak is in the bass. But it also comes down to exactly what the recording has in it. Because what I found with the 1266, and again this depends on exactly how much the seal's broken, but what I found is that because they're producing a peak in the bass at some point depending on that seal break, what you're then getting is that below that peak, things drop off a cliff in terms of the bass, and above that peak, you actually then get a bit of a dip, a gentle cut in the bass. And so what I found was that on some tracks, the bass from these is punchy, it's thunderous, it's amazing, it's tactile, it's fast. But then on other tracks where maybe the bass is a little bit higher and it starts to get into that dip, it starts to sound, I wouldn't go so far as saying anemic, but comparatively to when you get those tracks that hit the sweet spot of wherever the peak is for you when you're wearing the 1266, when you drift outside that peak, they actually can sound a little bit thinner, a little bit more what some people are going to probably call neutral. And so the trouble with that is that as you go from one album to the next, one track to the next, one genre to the next, you can get quite a different sonic experience. On most tracks, I think you'd say that the 1266 has a great sense of bass punch, but on some tracks, you can actually wonder what's happened. And that also means that there starts to become a sense of disconnectedness with the bass. This is what I spoke about before, where it's kind of like if you've got a subwoofer in the room and it's not perfectly aligned in terms of timing and distance from you as your main speakers, you start to feel like some of the bass is not connected completely to the rest of the track. Almost like the bass player was playing in another room and they've just tacked into the recording at the end. Now, I'm exaggerating it there to kind of make the point, and it's only really on critical listening that I started to hear this and notice this, but it is there. It makes them fun, it makes them interesting, it helps you to separate the sounds and the music and make it easier to kind of focus in on different parts. But if you're looking for an entirely natural and true-to-life experience, these aren't going to give it to you, I don't think at least. One final point to make about the bass, I said before that wherever that peak is in the bass, depending on the break of the seal, it then drops off a cliff afterwards. And what that also means is that if you have content that has a deep, deep extension in the bass, unless you've got these fully sealed, you're actually going to miss the bottom registers. And so going through some of the tracks I use for testing bass extension, it all came down to when that peak kicked in. So if I know something has a very, very low rumble that gradually gets higher in the frequency range, it would take a few moments at the beginning of the tracks, for instance, for that bass to kick in when it hit the right frequency range. And so again, if you're someone that's into genres like maybe EDM or other electronic music where it does have content at that 20 Hz and sort of 20 to 30 Hz range, you actually might find these a bit lacking in that regard unless you can get a seal on them. And this is a really interesting thing about the 1266. If you give them a seal, they're not going to have that same sense of punch and slam and impact, but they're going to go all the way to the bottom. If you then break the seal, you're going to lose that extension to the bottom, but you're going to get that bass slam and impact back. And again, this is where I find them to be a somewhat kind of quirky headphone. They're a bit inconsistent in some ways. And so where that leaves me from a tonality point of view is that overall, I think their tonality is very enjoyable. I think it's generally quite balanced. But I do find that they're a bit inconsistent, as I already mentioned. From one track to the next, the tonality can start to shift depending on where the points of emphasis are in the actual recording, the combination of instruments, vocals, what ranges they're in. That's where the 1266 can come a little bit undone. I would say for probably 80% of the music I listened to, they sounded great. And then for 20%, something just didn't sound quite right. There was a sound or an instrument that was too recessed because it happened to land in one of the dips within the frequency response of the 1266. Or it might have been a track that contained content where it kind of overly separated out those sounds because of those different chunks, like I said before, where the bass can feel a bit disconnected from the rest of the music. It's the exception rather than the rule for the 1266, but they're a little bit inconsistent in that regard. Before I move on to a couple of comparisons, I should mention some of the technicalities of these, and I think overall they're technically a very good sounding headphone. And what I mean by that is that they retrieve lots of detail, you get all the texture, all the nuance of sounds coming through them, particularly in the upper registers, maybe not so much down through the bass and the mids. The soundstage they produce is nothing short of exceptional. It's easily one of the best sound stages I've heard. They produce a lovely sense of space and scale in the stage. You can also adjust exactly what the shape of that stage is and just how big it is, how wide it is with that toe in and toe out adjustment, keeping in mind that's also going to be affecting your bass at the same time. And then within that soundstage, the imaging is also fantastic. Again, I think things like imaging are better in the upper registers, and that's because I think the phasing and the issues I talked about with phase in the bass and into the mids, I think that's muddying the waters a little bit for the imaging in those lower registers. And I think that's also what's partly going on with creating the sense of staging. And so they're a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, you can adjust the soundstage if you want to get more or less width and depth in the soundstage from that toe-in, toe-out effect. But as you do so, you have no choice but to affect the frequency response. And that's where they get a bit finicky for me. What I found was my balance point was keeping them pretty much straight. And what I mean by that is not really using the toe-in, toe-out too much. I did play with it a little bit, but I found I liked the balance point both tonally and spatially because I had to balance both of them. I tended to like the compromise of having it dead straight here, so with no rotation through that screw there, and then really just sitting off the side of the head with a slight break just at the front of the pads here. That to me was kind of my favourite. For reference, the pad position I found has the seam of the pad probably 1, maybe 2 notches up from the center point. So there's a seam at the front leading edge of the pad here, and you can either have that at essentially kind of the 3 o'clock position as I look at this ear cup. I've probably got it at the 2:30 position on there. And so that was the position I found to work best for me, but it is going to be different for everybody. And so with all that in mind, the final things I'd say about their sound quality and isolation is that I thought for classical music they were excellent. Their soundstage is very enjoyable for classical. They have a lovely sense of range and clarity for the orchestral music. Staging and imaging are both excellent for orchestras. The one area that let me down a little bit was I felt like the orchestra was kind of missing a sense of presence and body through the mid-bass area. And that is where you do get a bit of a dip, particularly once you've got that bass peak coming from the broken seal. That's where I felt that 1266 did let me down just a little bit. So it sounds like the cellos didn't have quite the same sense of body and presence that I'd like them to have. It means you're going to be able to more focus on things like the textures of the upper register strings, so your violas through your violins, your brass section, etc., the upper brass. But those lower registers do have just a little bit less weight than I'd like them to. On the other hand, when we move over to genres like rock and blues and funk, things that want some drive and some rhythm, the 1266 are bunches of fun. That bass punch you get from that kind of subwoofer-like experience, that extra peak that you get from the broken seal, all of that makes them really, really enjoyable, very engaging and very fun. I don't think they quite match my all-time favourite for pure fun in something like the Meze Empyrean, but I think they're technically far superior to that. So if you're looking for a fun headphone that's also got a bit more resolution and clarity, then that's, I think, where I could see someone really enjoying the 1266. But to help provide a bit more context and share with you why I'm not completely sold on the 1266 despite enjoying it and respecting it, let's do a couple of comparisons with the ZMF Caldera and also the Meze Elite. Kicking off with the ZMF Caldera, which comes in at $3,500 US, making it a full $2,500 US cheaper than the 1266. And the first track I tried on these was Eye Opener by Noah. Immediately the Abyss sounded fantastic on Noah's vocal, whereas when I switched over to the Caldera, the opening guitar sounded more real and more present. And this speaks immediately as a great example of what I'm saying about the inconsistencies of tonality and presence in the mix when using the 1266. Some things that hit the right frequency range sound amazing, they're forward and they're present, but other sounds like the opening guitar in this track kind of get pushed to the back and hidden behind everything else. Jumping back to the Caldera, the vocal from Noah still had presence and clarity. It wasn't as heavily emphasized from the Caldera as it was from the 1266, but it was better balanced overall with everything else because everything else wasn't shoved aside. I do think some people could find the Caldera a little bit too forward in the upper mids compared to the 1266. The Caldera is not quite shouty, but it starts to border in that direction depending on the track, depending on your source chain and your tastes. But for me, overall, the Caldera just sounded more real. Everything sounded as I expected it should. Nothing surprised me. Nothing kind of made me go, hang on, what's that sound? Where's that in the mix? Why can't I hear that properly? Even though I think the 1266 does a much better job of creating space in the soundstage and separating sounds, the Caldera just sounded more real and everything was more available for me to listen to. It wasn't as separated and focused in the soundstage, perhaps because the soundstage is smaller, but it was much more available. If I wanted to think to myself, what does the string section sound like, I could very quickly and easily identify it. Whereas I found that less easy to do with the 1266, except if it was one of those specific instruments or specific sounds that landed in a point of emphasis for the 1266's frequency response. just in case it was one of those situations where the particular track favoured the particular headphone, I hunted around and also made some notes on 2020 by Quentin Dujardin. The 1266 brought the accordion in this track all the way forwards. It made it really present, really available. But again, it kind of disembodied it a little bit. It broke it away from the rest of the mix, and everything else was pushed a little bit to the back. I felt like the bass from the 1266 in this track was actually being overemphasized, but the upper register drums, so your toms and your snare, those didn't sound quite real from the 1266, again because we've got these different points of emphasis that don't always align within the frequency response. Flipping over to the Calderas on this track, and the drum kit sounded natural and real and lifelike. And that really shows to me exactly what I find challenging about the 1266. They're enjoyable on their own. If you don't think too hard about them, they're a good fun listen. But the more I spent time with them, the more I listened to them, no matter how much I played with them, I always felt like they were playing tricks with the music. It's kind of like acoustic DSP. And obviously it's not DSP, that's digital, that's what it stands for, is digital sound processing or signal processing. There's nothing digital going on here, but the way you're adjusting things like the phase of the headphone and the frequency response of the headphone, to me just always feels like they're getting between me and the music rather than delivering the music to me. And it can be fun, it can be enjoyable, but I never found myself completely relaxing into the music because it always sounded like something was not quite right, something was always being manipulated, and therefore something was often missing. And so the 1266 is fun if you're happy to be focused on what it wants to emphasize based on its particular tuning and how you've got it set up. But you do kind of need to know going in that you're getting what the 1266 wants to give you, not necessarily what's exactly in the recording. Now, I don't mean that in kind of a what the artist intended kind of way. No headphone is giving you exactly what's in the recording. No source chain is giving you exactly what's in the recording. But the point is, I think these are actually extremely coloured and coloured in a fun way, but coloured in a way that's not just a slight tonal variation so much as a complete reinterpretation of the signal. It can be fun, but it might not be what you're after. And so if we then move on to comparing the 1266 to the Meze Elites, from memory, the Meze Elites, I think when I wrote my notes, these come in at about $4,000. And so you're still $2,000 cheaper than the 1266, and you're still getting a flagship type headphone. But let's talk about how well they stack up with each other. For this track, I was using I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good by Charles Brown. And this track is basically just a vocal and a piano. I happened to start with the Elites on this track, and the piano just sounded fantastic. It sounded natural, it sounded resonant, there was the percussiveness, but there was also that sort of harmonic richness that a piano should have. And then when the vocal came in, it was intimate, it was rich, and it was textured. And I don't mean intimate in a kind of in-your-face way, but this is just a very simple recording of a single person singing into a microphone and playing a piano. So you don't necessarily want things blown apart too much, and the Elite delivered it in a very natural way. When I moved over to the 1266s, the first thing I noticed was that the piano just didn't quite sound right. If I wasn't paying attention, if it was just playing in the background and I was just relaxing doing something else and letting these play music, I would have thoroughly enjoyed the track. But because I was critically listening to it, and particularly because I'd just come from a reference point in the Elites, what I noticed was that it was like the piano was only being played in the upper registers because that's where the emphasis was. But I know for a fact, and you could actually hear some of it, that there is full range piano being played. There's a left hand and a right hand part, but all the emphasis went on that right hand, and so you were getting lots of the percussiveness, you were getting lots of the higher register information, but it was lacking the resonance in the body that a piano should absolutely have. When Charles Brown's vocal came in, it was a bit more distant from me compared to the Elites, in a good way. Neither was better nor worse, they were both excellent. So the 1266 delivered it with a bit more space and a bit more depth overall on the soundstage. And they also brought a greater sense of texture in the vocal, but it came at the expense of some richness. Now, I'm not going to say for a second that I think the 1266 or the Elite is doing the vocal correctly, or better or worse. The vocals were just different. I think the thing that really stood out to me was the piano. The piano is a full-range instrument. It's a wonderful test of tonal balance in a headphone or a speaker system, because if the tonal balance is handled well, then the piano should sound pretty consistent from the bottom of the range all the way to the top. In the Elites, it generally does. There's a few little nuances there, but they're fairly subtle. Whereas with the 1266, it doesn't. There's some areas in the lower registers that drop away, and there's kind of an overemphasis on those upper registers and the percussiveness and the textual information of the piano. And so I think by now you kind of got my sense of the 1266. It's a headphone that I understand why people enjoy. It's a fun listen. For certain genres, it can be incredibly enjoyable, but I think for $6,000 it's not one I'm going to recommend. Given that you could buy yourself a pair of Calderas or Elites and then another pair of headphones in that $2,000 to $2,500 range, for that sort of money you can get two completely different headphones and have lots of range, lots of performance, rather than having one headphone that is going to sound great on some tracks and then not so great on others. Why not buy two fantastic headphones and choose which headphone you want for those two different genres? I also think that the lack of comfort from these, or I probably shouldn't say lack of comfort, they're as comfortable as they can be. I think they've actually done a wonderful job of making them comfortable, but the fact that they're still a 640 gram headphone makes them long-term a less comfortable headphone. And for me, if I'm spending $6,000, I kind of want something I'm going to have on my head all the time. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to be spending that sort of money, I want to be able to listen to it for as long as I want to, not for as long as it will allow me to before I get a hotspot on my head. And so overall, I wouldn't say I'm disappointed in the 1266, but I'm also going to be quite happy to send them home. They're not a headphone I feel the need to keep. They're not a headphone I've been reaching for once I finished my review and listening notes process. And so again, if you've bought these or you're thinking about buying them and you love them, I totally get that. I totally understand why you would. They're a lot of fun. They're enjoyable. But from a reviewer perspective, if you said to me, should I spend $6,000 or actually more if you want any of the optional bits and pieces, should I spend $6,000 or more on a pair of 1266? My honest answer is always going to be no. Go out and buy yourself two other headphones. Go out and buy yourself a Susvara and some other cheaper headphone. Go out and buy yourself a Meze Elite and a pair of ZMFs. Go out and buy yourself a Caldera and a pair of something else. There's so many different headphones you could buy for the same budget, and in my opinion, get as good if not better performance in many ways. You're going to have a hard time matching the staging and imaging these give you. The bass is lots and lots of fun, there is no doubt about that at all, but they're just not a headphone I can recommend because of the inconsistencies they represent. And so I know that I'm probably going to upset a few people with this review, not my intention, I'm sorry if you feel that way about it. But hopefully for the rest of you that have considered these, maybe you've been curious about them, hopefully I've filled in some gaps, satisfied some curiosity, and given you a sense of where I think these fit into the world of headphones. If you have found the video useful, helpful, informative, etc., I'd love it as always if you'd hit the like button, and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.